Chapter 5. Shuyi admitted that when she sat up, she deliberately bent her posture, managed her expression, and even calmly adjusted how to position her legs for the best look. She doesn't know how good Shi Yan's eyes are, and whether she can discover her inner beauty, so the outer beauty must always be clearly displayed in front of him. But at this moment, the car windows were open, and the cold wind that was about to enter the winter was pouring into the car as if it didn't cost money. Shuyi lost all thoughts, put his legs back calmly, wrapped his coat tightly, took out the recorder, cleared his throat, and said, "Mr. Shi, shall I turn on the recorder now?" Shi Yan leaned back on the back chair, closed his eyes, didn't even open his mouth, and said in response to Shuy's words. "I'm afraid I'm going to fall asleep in the next second. Do I look so unattractive?" Shuyi was cursing in his heart, but his mouth was obedient. "I will record the whole process, and I will check it with you after the final draft is out." After finishing speaking, Shi Yan didn't respond, and still kept his eyes closed. Shuyi dug out the outline. The topic of this interview mainly revolves around the role of the RMB as a pillar currency. First, I would like to ask you to talk about the role of a large commercial bank in promoting the internationalization of the RMB. What preparations do you think you need to make? After hearing Shuy's words, Shi Yan turned his head to the side, pressed his chin, and gave Shuyi a casual look. Shuyi didn't know what this meant, so he had to look back. Unexpectedly, Shi Yan didn't look away. She didn't know what expression to put on when they looked at each other, so she could only blink her eyes. Putting aside other factors, she has been preparing for this job for a long time, and naturally, she has as much anxiety as she has anticipation. After a while, Shi Yan didn't know what to think of, let out a little snort in his nose, and then looked away. "Shuyi, if it wasn't for my ulterior motives for you, I would have to let you talk about what your micro-expression means today." When Shuyi was slandering, Shi Yan raised his hand and loosened the tie, and then began to answer Shuy's question. When he uttered the first sentence, Shuyi hadn't recovered yet, was taken aback for a moment, and immediately lowered his head and began to record. What Shi Yan said was very logical and interlocking, and he answered sentence by sentence. Although there were not many words, the amount of information was full. Shuyi did not dare to miss a sentence, and listened carefully. The car kept moving forward at high speed, went up the mountain road, entered the tunnel, and circled the overpass. Shuyi never raised his head to notice the changes outside the window. She threw out topics one by one, and had little free time to think about where the car would go. When she finished asking about the content of the outline, the recording pen showed that 1 hour and 56 minutes had passed. It is difficult to catch up with his train of thought. The requirements for attention are almost at the level of the exam, and during the period, he has to analyze what he said, so Shuyi recorded the last points at that time. There was already a fine layer of sweat on the palms of the hands. Shuyi raised her head, glanced at Shi Yan, and saw that his expression was calm, but not as nervous as her. Her gaze gradually rested on his eyes. Viewed from the side, the lenses coated his eyelashes with a layer of light, showing no emotion, but it was hard to look away. "Have you finished asking?" Shi Yan suddenly turned to look at her. Shuyi suddenly looked away. "It's over." Next second, Shuyi. The already quiet car seemed even quieter. She closed the pen cap, pretended nothing happened, flipped through the notebook with a downcast face, trying to hide her embarrassment of peeking at him being caught. After a moment of silence, Shuyi began to feel a little uneasy, and quietly raised his eyes to look at Shi Yan. Just met Shi Yan's eyes. He slowly sat up straight, raised his hand to straighten his tie, and looked at her with dim eyes. The car stopped slowly at this time. Shuyi secretly sweated. Mouth it should be developed obscenely. The interior of the car continued to be silent. A gust of cold wind blew in, and Shuyi shivered suddenly. At this gap, Shi Yan averted his eyes, opened the car door, got out of the car with a bow, and left a word. 2 hours are up. Shuyi. His series of movements were too fast, and Shuyi was in a daze for a while, before waking up from the tension in the stare at each other just now. She immediately raised her head and looked out the car window. There are large expanses of grass, rows of wooden stake fences, and a few horses grazing sporadically in the middle. The woods at the end are withered and yellow, and the sky is gray and dark clouds are piled up. It feels like the woods will be crushed in the next second. What kind of ghostly place is this? Shi Yan stood beside the car, looked up into the distance, and seemed to have forgotten the existence of Shuyi. Shuyi clasped the car window with both hands, flustered, and Shi Yan's back seemed to have the word indifference written in bold. Just when she was about to speak, Shi Yan turned her head and rolled her eyelids. You can go. Shuyi, how can I get out of this barren mountain? Go on horseback. Seeing that Shi Yan was really about to leave, Shuyi hurriedly got out of the car and chased after him. Mr. Shi, there is one last question. She pursed her lips. Why don't we talk about other topics? Shi Yan focused on his phone and didn't look at Shuyi. Explain. Shuyi stood behind him and asked, do you have a girlfriend? Shi Yan paused with his fingertips and turned his head to look over. Shuyi looked at Shi Yan with a smile, and it seemed that there was no other meaning. After all, many reporters would use such questions at the end of the interview to liven up the atmosphere. In fact, her hand on the side of her leg has already clenched into a fist. Shi Yan's eyes moved down, and he sized her face a few inches with a sense of probing. When he was about to speak, a male voice came from not far away. Time banquet. Immediately, Shi Yan raised his head, and a white-haired old man in equestrian clothes walked towards them quickly. At first, Shuyi just followed Shi Yan to look at the past, and felt that the old man's voice sounded familiar. When he got closer and his face became clear, Shuyi suddenly realized that he really knew him. To be precise, it should be a unilateral acquaintance with this well-known bigwig in the financial world. Shuyi majored in journalism at a college of finance and economics as an undergraduate. In the first professional class, the teacher mentioned this person, Guan Xiangqing. Since then, the name Guan Xiangqing has been used throughout Shuyi's entire college years, and it has been mentioned frequently after work. His voice and appearance are everywhere in TV, magazines, and newspapers. Although Guan Xiangqing has retired now and rarely appears in front of the public, his prestige is still as high as Mount Tai. Of course, Shuyi has also heard that Guan Xiangqing's greatest hobby is equestrianism. So where she is now, it should be Guan Xiangqing's private racecourse. Holding a leather horsewhip in his hand, Guan Xiangqing walked leisurely in this direction, and slowly noticed Shuyi beside him. Seeing a strange woman suddenly, Guan Xiangqing unconsciously slowed down his steps and looked at her a little more. But after thinking about it, it seems that it is not uncommon for a man to bring a woman to appear, and the first sentence he spoke became, "Who is this?" He pointed at Shuyi. Before Shi Yan could speak, Shuyi took the lead and said, Mr. Guan, I am Shuyi, a reporter from Caijing Weekly, Financial Weekly. Guan Xiangqing nodded. I have an impression of you. I have read a few of your articles. The writing is good and in-depth. I didn't expect that I was still a young girl. I don't know if this compliment was just to save face, but Shuyi accepted it calmly. She looked up and smiled. You are too much. After a short introduction, Guan Xiangqing immediately looked at his guest today, and said cheerfully, I thought you came alone, and you didn't prepare anything. There are very few girls in my poor place. Hearing the meaning of this, Shuyi knew that he had misunderstood that he came with Shi Yan, and probably thought that they had an unusual relationship. Shuyi lowered her head, rubbed her cuffs lightly with her fingers, thinking quickly in her mind. Uncle Guan, gosh. Just as Shi Yan opened his mouth, the woman beside him let out a small exclamation. Shi Yan turned her head and saw her looking up at the racetrack in front of her. Her face was full of surprise. This place is so beautiful. While speaking, she turned her head and glanced around. Her long hair was blown by the wind, and her eyes were shining. These horses are so beautiful. It seems that she is really an innocent girl who is attracted by the scenery. Shuyi felt that this wave of acting skills of hers was like an Oscar for China. Putting aside what he was about to say, Shi Yan frowned and looked at Shuyi thoughtfully. It's not my best horse yet. Guan Xiangqing answered immediately. No matter how high-ranking or important a person is, at this age, he can't help showing off his treasures. The real BMW is inside. There is more. Shuyi looked curious and expectant. Guan Xiangqing couldn't see it. He put away the whip in his hand, and waved to the two. Come on, come in. After Guan Xiangqing finished speaking, he turned around and walked in, leaving Shuyi and Shi Yan behind. In open places, the wind is always particularly strong, blowing through the woods, whistling. The people around him didn't speak, but Shuyi could feel that he was looking at her. Regardless of Guan Xiangqing's status, she was sure that she would not explain more in front of him during the banquet, and put these children's fights on the table, so she dared to do so. But this kind of scrutiny seems to be suffering, and a second will be stretched infinitely. Shuyi's breathing was a little irregular, her hands were behind her waist, and her index finger was disturbing everything uneasily. She waited for a few seconds, but before the other party could speak, she was heartbroken and looked up at Shi Yan. Sure enough, it ran into his gaze. Shuyi blinked, looking innocent, as if to say, "Guan Xiangqing invited me, what's wrong? Is there any problem?" Shuyi didn't know if there was anything wrong with Shi Yan, anyway, he just showed a chuckle of unknown meaning, then stopped talking to her, and followed Guan Xiangqing's footsteps. Entering the racecourse, Guan Xiangqing stood outside the dressing room. Shi Yan went straight to the locker room, stepped through the door, and as if he remembered something, turned to look at Shuyi where his back was facing Guan Xiangqing. He pressed his eyelids, "I'll go in and change." Although the voice was calm, it carried a warning tone. Shuyi smiled brightly, and said in a sweet voice, "Yes. I will wait obediently. Time banquet." He stopped talking and went straight into the dressing room. Only Guan Xiangqing and Shuyi were left outside. If it's a stranger, Guan Xiangqing maintains his own identity and is the least talkative type of person. But today he obviously regarded Shuyi as the person brought by Shi Yan. He just heard the conversation between these two people back and forth. He brought a horse over, and chatted casually with Shuyi while stroking its hair. After chatting a few words about the industry, he changed the subject. "How long have you known Shi Yan?" Shuyi was stunned for a moment, before realizing what he meant. She lowered her eyes, and looked shy. "I've known you not long ago. I just met today." Guan Xiangqing had an idea, nodded with a smile, and patted the pony in front of him. "Can you ride a horse?" Shuyi said no. Guan Xiangqing turned around and pointed to the dressing room. "There are my wife's old clothes in it. If you don't mind, you can wear them. You are here, you can learn." Really, riding a horse is far away from daily life. Even if it wasn't because of the banquet, Shuyi still had this bit of curiosity, so the surprise at this moment was not a show at all, and he followed Guan Xiangqing into the dressing room with some joy. Although it is a private racecourse, the dressing room is really not small, with 4 compartments on each side. She was walking behind Guan Xiangqing. When she passed a cubicle, she turned her head and saw Shi Yan behind the curtain. The door curtain barely blocked the position from the chest to the ankle. Shi Yan turned around and met Shuyi's gaze. He took off his glasses and narrowed his eyes slightly. Although the locker room was brightly lit, Shi Yan's gaze was a bit chilly. Shuyi, who had a ghost in his heart, felt a little guilty when he saw it, and turned his face away with twinkling eyes. Feeling that gaze chasing her back, she frowned and quickened her pace. Guan Xiangqing led her to a cabinet, opened the door, and a faint scent of incense filled her nostrils. There is a set of red equestrian clothes hanging in the cabinet. Judging from the color of the buttons, it should be some years old, but the material is very high grade, and the tailoring is very neat. You can change it. My wife's figure is about the same as yours. It should be suitable. After Guan Xiangqing finished speaking, he walked out. The locker room fell silent. Shuyi took out the suit, and when choosing a compartment, he could look over at Shi Yan. It's a pity that there is a tall locker in the middle. She can't see the situation on the other side, and doesn't know if Shi Yan is still there. There's been no movement for so long, he should have gone out. Shuyi turned and entered the compartment. She took off her clothes and carefully changed into this equestrian suit. When she was about to unbutton the last button of the collar, she suddenly heard the sound of footsteps. Shuyi paused with her fingertips, stopped her movements, and carefully identified whether the footsteps were coming towards her. Unfortunately not. The footsteps are getting farther and farther away, probably about to go out. Shuyi touched the belt with his fingers, and suddenly said, "Mr. Shi." The footsteps outside stopped. Standing in the cubicle, Shuyi smiled unscrupulously. "How to tie this belt? Can you teach me?" After waiting for a few seconds, footsteps sounded again. The locker room is covered with wooden floors, suppressing the sound very muffled. He came. Shuyi let go of his hand and quickly began to cut his hair. But after a few seconds, she realized something was wrong. The footsteps seemed to be getting farther and farther away. Just after thinking about it, there was a bang, the sound of closing the door, and a gust of wind brought out a corner of the curtain in front of Shuyi. His voice echoed clearly in the locker room. "If you don't know how to tie it, don't ride it." Chapter 6. Marquez once said that when a woman decides to date a man, there is no wall she cannot overcome, no fortress she cannot overthrow, no worry she cannot let go. In fact, there is no one who can control her god. So is Shuyi now facing an iron wall? Is it a mountain of swords and a sea of fire? Is it the wrath of God? No, it was just a small rejection from him. Okay, she closed her eyes and took a breath. After adjusting her mentality, she straightened her neckline and walked out. When the door of the locker room was opened, the open wilderness came into view, and the grass moved when the wind blew, and several horses lowered their heads leisurely to fiddle with the grass. Shuyi buttoned up the buttons, and when she looked up, she saw that the clouds had cleared and the sun had dropped below the horizon, and thousands of rays of light stretched across the sky. Under the golden sunlight, Shi Yan stood beside a reddish-brown horse. His black cavalier suit was elegant and full of tension, and the horse's fur was groomed to shine like satin. The picturesque scene has a harmonious rhythm. Shuyi couldn't help but take a second look. Is it changed? Guan Xiangqing walked over leading a horse, leaning his arm on the saddle, and looked Shuyi up and down. It's quite suitable. After speaking, he patted his horse, turned his head and waved to Shi Yan. The three of them were not far away, and Shi Yan could see every move here. He let go of the reins and walked towards them. When he approached, Guan Xiangqing said, "This horse is the most docile, let Shi Yan teach you how to ride it." Shuyi immediately looked at Shi Yan. He stopped, lowered his head and straightened his white gloves, without making a sound. After Guan Xiangqing finished speaking, he left. After a while, Shuyi heard the sound of galloping horseshoes, and Shi Yan put on the gloves, walked to the side of the horse, and smoothed the hair leisurely, but didn't make any further moves. In fact, in the short chat before, Shuyi probably figured out the relationship between Shi Yan and Guan Xiangqing. They are not relatives, but Guan Xiangqing has a certain friendship with Shi Yan's father, and today Shi Yan is here to accompany him to pass the time. A person like Shi Yan can come to accompany him to pass the time, which shows his position in Shi Yan's heart. It's not absolute intimacy, but more respect, so he is bound to show his best side in front of him. So Shuyi coughed lightly. Shi Yan looked up at her. "Mr. Shi." Shuyi smiled shyly, looked at Shi Yan anxiously, "Then please teach me." Good. For some reason, his tone gave Shuyi a sense of malice. Maybe it's an illusion. Shuyi gave herself psychological counseling. What can she do? Can you still feed her to the horse? So she raised her head and said with a smile, "Then thank you, Mr. Shi." Shi Yan raised his hand and made a please gesture. Shuyi is not a squeamish person either. She has the habit of exercising and has a foundation in dancing, so it is not difficult for her to get on a horse. The equestrian pants she was wearing were soft and soft. She stepped up easily and neatly, shook her hair, grabbed the saddle, and looked down at Shi Yan. Shi Yan held the rein in his hand, glanced at her, and took a step back. Shuyi blinked her eyes. Shouldn't she be walking in front and leading the horse? What are you doing behind? Before she could figure it out, a wave of heat surged behind her, the saddle sank, and the horse leaped forward a few steps. Due to inertia, Shuyi leaned back and leaned against a person's chest. Suddenly, the air seemed to stop flowing. Shuyi's upper body froze completely and remained motionless, which intensified her sensory acuity, and she could clearly feel the breath of Shi Yan slowly enveloping her whole body. Shi Yan stretched out his hand to hold the rein, and wrapped Shuyi in his arms with both arms. Shuyi, it seems that there is no need to teach like this. Shi Yan seemed to have noticed Shuyi's stiffness. What's wrong? His tone was very light, but Shuyi seemed to hear a hint of sarcasm. Her nervousness must have been fully exposed, and there is no point in covering it up now. It's okay. Shuyi gritted his teeth and said word by word, "It's my first time riding a horse, so I'm a little nervous." Shi Yan let out a but inexplicably, Shuyi felt that his back was cold. Why did even the word make her feel that something was wrong? Under Shi Yan's movements, the horse walked slowly. The afterglow sprinkled on the horse, and with the shaking of the horse's back, the halo was particularly dazzling. Shi Yan was not in a hurry, didn't speak, and just walked towards the runway like a walk. Shuyi felt that her breathing was no longer smooth, and she was even a little hot. The ups and downs, caused by the horse walking, would make the top of her head touch Shi Yan's chin. Shuyi always felt that something was wrong. Although she has only been in contact with Shi Yan for a few hours, his temperament is already evident, and it shouldn't be like this. Just as he was thinking, Guan Xiangqing, who had already ridden far away, turned his head and waved at the two of them, signaling them to follow. Before Shuyi had time to respond, the horse under him suddenly shook and galloped away. Ah, she couldn't control her exclamation, and gripped the saddle tightly in the bumps. The horse ran very fast, and the saddle under her bumped into it again and again, causing pain between her legs, and coupled with the extremely fast acceleration of gravity, it made Shuyi dizzy after a few bumps. Moreover, Shi Yan seemed to intentionally keep a certain physical distance from her, and his arms were not around her, so every time. Chapter 7. In fact, Shuyi left the bathroom on the front foot, and Su Yuling followed behind. The two walked back towards the office area of the financial group one after the other, with a distance of less than 3 meters. If on weekdays, people from the same group came out one after the other, not to mention being so close arm in arm, they would have to talk side by side. But at that time, the two of them were like strangers, one with happy brows and the other with earthy face, self-evident gossip diffused from their bodies silently. Shuyi looked at the phone calmly under the obvious or inconspicuous stares of colleagues around him, then got up and walked towards Tang Yi's office. Shuyi also understood that this kind of thing hovering on the edge of unspoken rules has never been constrained by rules and regulations. Since the matter has not become a big deal, Tang Yi does not want to spend too much time dealing with this matter. Su Yuling is really unkind in this matter. I warned her just now and wrote her a note. The performance and year-end evaluation are all put behind. I will definitely put an end to this situation in the future. Seeing Shuyi's unmoved expression, she added, they're all in the same group. If you don't look up and look down, it's impossible to fire her because of this, right? After working under Tang Yi for all these years, Shuyi already knew that she would deal with these matters with a gentle attitude, and she didn't expect her to give a clear explanation. It's just that the dumb loss that was almost calculated by others, even if he didn't eat it in the end, the anger still couldn't dissipate by himself. Shuyi looked down at his nails and didn't speak. From Tang Yi's perspective, Shuyi lowered her eyes, her curled eyelashes covered her eyes, but her pouting lips still showed her dissatisfaction. Tang Yi suddenly felt a little helpless. She couldn't stand Shuyi's expression like this. She was a little bit of a natural coquettish, like acting like a baby, and like being emotional, making it impossible to refuse cruelly. As soon as her thoughts diverged, she thought of Shuyi's ex-boyfriend again. After all, what kind of stunning beauty did he fall in love with, so that he would be willing not to have such a beauty? Or is it that the bad roots of men are so deep-rooted? There was an odd silence in the office. Tang Yi was deeply involved in that puzzling philosophical question. She didn't come back to her senses until an invitation reminder came up on the software. While reading the news, she said, "Can this matter stop here? It's useless, your side must be on this year's Q4 key column layout." Shuyi lazily said, and when she stood up, Tang Yi coaxed her again, "This is not to compensate you, but your content is indeed much more valuable than hers." The same interviewee, similar outline, people. There is still a gap between people and people. Oh. Shuyi raised his eyebrows, his eyes tinged with complacency. That can't be helped, I prefer to ask for a banquet. Okay. Tang Yi glanced at her while sorting out the meeting materials. Her glance seemed to say, have you drank fake wine, are you talking or writing something whimsical? Knowing that you are the strongest in our group in terms of deep digging, you don't have to be humble. Shuyi. Not even modesty. Why can't I be a person who depends on my appearance? What does the editor-in-chief say? There was a summit forum in the financial center in the afternoon, and the company arranged for Shuyi and Kong Nan to go there together. On the way, the conversation between the two naturally revolved around Su Yuling's matter. Kong Nan saw that Shuyi's expression was good, and knew that she should not suffer from this matter, should it be dealt with. What can be done? Shuyi held a small mirror to touch up her makeup, and said without saying a word, it's not like you don't know Editor Tang. If big things are turned into small things, it's hard to make Su Yuling under the national flag review. Tisk. Kong Nan made a motion to vomit. This happened to me when I joined the campus news agency when I was a student, and that person is still the head reporter of the TV station. There is no way. Despicableness is the passport of villains. Although Shuyi didn't answer the conversation, he pressed the powder puff hard. She held grudges and couldn't swallow this breath easily. 20 minutes later, the taxi arrived at the destination and was pulling over. Shuyi was sitting on the right and got out of the car first. Kong Nan was sitting inside, bent over with her bag to get out, when Shuyi from outside suddenly squeezed in and pushed her inside, then closed the car door. "What are you doing?" Kong Nan almost collapsed in the car, leaning half of his body on the seat, looking at Shuyi in horror. "Is the ground outside burning your feet?" Shuyi compared her with a shut-up gesture, sitting up and taking a breath. "Hell, she actually saw Yu Xingzhou just now. It's nothing to see Yu Xingzhou here, after all, it's where he works. But he actually got out of the driver's seat of a Mercedes-Benz. You even got a new car so soon." For a moment, Shuyi felt smoke rising from his head. Normally, she would not be afraid of bumping into Yu Xingzhou. It's just that in this situation, Yu Xingzhou was driving a Mercedes-Benz, while she was sitting in a taxi, which was too real in the world. Seeing that Shuyi didn't speak, Kong Nan poked his head out a little, turned his eyes forward, and happened to see Yu Xingzhou too. He went around to the trunk, moved something out, and then left. Kong Nan blinked. "Isn't that your boyfriend?" I'll be careful to verify and make a bold guess." "You broke up." "And you were the one who got dumped. If I'm not wrong, you were not only dumped, but also green." "Okay, it seems that the other party's new girlfriend is still a rich man, and she has replaced it with a new car." Shuyi sighed, and watched Yu Xingzhou go farther and farther before he heaved a sigh of relief. His whole shoulders collapsed, and he looked at Kong Nan desperately. "Actually, you don't have to guess so accurately." Kong Nan was not surprised that the result of his analysis was correct, and he was even a little proud. "If I don't even have this sensitivity to collect information under the current background, I will be a journalist, okay?" Shuyi. It wasn't until Yu Xingzhou entered a coffee shop that Shuyi opened the car door and got out, followed by Kong Nan. "Oh, it's actually okay." Seeing Shuyi walking so fast, Kong Nan trotted to catch up, and still didn't forget to look back at the Mercedes-Benz. "It's just a Mercedes-Benz C, which costs more than 300,000 yuan. Well, it's not a good car, but we can't afford it if we work hard." Having said that, Shuyi also looked back at the car, but the figure of Shi Yan appeared in his mind. "I switched between Rolls-Royce and Bentley for a while, but buy a Mercedes-Benz for more than 300,000 yuan for my niece. This man is not only picky, but also vulgar." Thinking of Shi Yan, Shuyi stroked his empty earlobe thoughtfully. In the evening, the first off-duty rush hour of Jiangqing CBD came. Pedestrians were in a hurry and vehicles were in order. A black Rolls-Royce slowly merged into the traffic flow. Shi Yan sat in the back row, took off his glasses, closed his eyes, and rubbed his eyebrows, with a meeting minutes in hand. The moment he opened his eyes, he seemed to see a small dazzling thing on the seat next to him. He put on his glasses and looked carefully. It was a pearl earring. Shi Yan picked it up, thinking about who left it behind, when Qinxing's cell phone rang in the front row. After he connected, he said twice, hesitated for a moment, then turned around and handed over the phone. "Mr. Shi, reporter Shuyi from Kaijing Weekly is looking for you." Shi Yan lowered his eyes, clasped his palms together to hold the earrings in his palm, and took Qinxing's cell phone with his other hand. He responded calmly, and the other side answered the call immediately. He yelled Shirzong with a downward sound at the end, which sounded a little flustered. "I seem to have left the earring on your car. Did you see it? It's a pearl earring." Shi Yan let go of his palm again. Night was about to fall, and the sky turned from dim yellow to dark blue. Only the driver's searchlight was turned on in the car, and the peripheral light penetrated into the back row, illuminating the pearl in his palm. "Did not see it." Shuyi paused, then continued, "Can I trouble you to take another look? This earring is really important to me." "How important is it?" Shuyi paused again. "Is that the point?" "Never mind. It was, my grandmother gave it to my mother, and my mother gave it to me." There was no sound on the other side of the phone. Shuyi choked up a bit. "It is a family heirloom of our family." There was still no answer on the other side. Shuyi took a deep breath, and her voice was filled with tears. "It is my dowry, and I will bring it to the wedding in the future. Whenever I see it, I will think of my grandma. I haven't seen her for a long, long time. Past her." This part of the performance is affectionate and pitiful. There was a moment of silence on the phone, and Shi Yan's usually cold voice was a little hoarse. "Well, now I see." Shuyi squinted his eyes and smiled, stretched his whole body, and turned half a circle with his toes on the ground. "Use the earrings to get a chance to meet and plan to pass. That, Shuyi didn't finish his sentence, waiting to see Shi Yan's attitude. The voice on the other side sounded calmly. Your dowry is plastic. Shuyi.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to our channel for more captivating illustrated romance audiobooks. Don't miss out on our latest releases and be part of our growing community. Hit that subscribe button and embark on an enchanting journey with us.